Hey folks, this is Dennis with Las Vegas Worm Farm, and this is the monthly newsletter. Try to get some videos out to you guys, and we're going to condense down what we talked about for the month so you guys can get prepared in your gardens and have everything set and ready to go. So the first thing we're going to talk about is getting your seeds ready, and that usually starts well in advance. And what I like to do is I like to use my little, book. Don't judge me. I like flowers. Um, in here is there basically like a calendar. So what I do is I kind of decide what I want to plant and how long it's going to take to plant. Everybody knows you can look at the back of the seed bag and it'll tell you how long until maturity or fruiting, right? So in this instance, let's talk about pumpkin seeds. They're about 120 days, right? So if you want pumpkins ready to carve to go for Halloween, we're talking about October 31st. October 31st, there's 30 days in October, 30 days in September, 30 days in August. We're at 90 days, and now we got 30 days in July. Rough math, you don't have to get exact. So for me, the 4th of July is the date that I want to get pumpkins into the ground. So that's kind of how I figure out when I'm going to start planting things or putting seeds together or a seed tray or anything like that. Or that's what I'm going to do to get my seeds ready, whether I'm going to put them in trays or soil blocks or right into the dirt. Next thing we'll kind of talk about is different ways to set up your seeds, right? So we have these little containers that you can start your seeds in, put your seed mix in here. You can do those. We've also got, these little trays that you've seen before. You fill these up with your soil. That way you can get that going. If you got soil blocks, I like using these things. They create their own little tray, and then you can just put all your seed blocks in there and everything will stay nice to put together. They've also got massive trays. These have holes in it. Of course, if you're going to be putting seed blocks or some seed containers into here, you want to make sure the bottom is one solid piece so it retains that moisture. And the next thing, once you have your seed mix in those little containers or you created your seed block, next thing we want to talk about is keeping it covered. I like keeping things covered just because it retains that moisture. I need that moisture to keep the seed moist so that it can burst out of that shell easier. If the seed doesn't get enough moisture, it's not going to be able to break that shell. In addition to that, the microbiology that's in that moisture will help kind of break down that seed coat so that the seed can germinate easier. So if there's not enough moisture, then things won't live and they won't survive. Talking about moisture, I have a container right here and it comes with this handy dandy lid. Sometimes these containers come with the lid. They create their own little greenhouse, their own little igloo, and you can keep everything nice and moist in here. You don't have to worry about watering all the time and keeping it moist. You can just keep the lid on and it'll keep everything nice and moist. Now, if you're using solo cups like this, which I've had before, poke a little hole in the bottom so I don't overwater it, right? You can also use little bags. So easy thing to do is just grab some Ziploc bags, and what you can do is just take that Ziploc bag and put it right over your little cups. And now you're doing the same thing. You're creating that little igloo, that little greenhouse to keep all that moisture inside. Makes it a lot easier than playing this game of spritzing it and keeping it moist, because the seeds usually stay at the top. But we'll talk about that here in a second. The next thing is, what if I got a tray like this and it doesn't have a bag or anything? Well, then I like to go for, the cellophane. And what we do here is we'll just grab a piece and you just have to rip it off the size of the container, right? And then we just put it over. And that's pretty much it. So now I got it covered. You got the plastic, creates the same little environment, keeps the moisture inside, the humidity, so that the seed stays wet, the soil stays moist, and everybody's happy. The microorganisms are getting all the water that they need to help break down that seed coat. The next thing we want to talk about is we need to have that soil make contact with the seed. That's super important. The seed needs to be touched as many times as possible. And what that really comes down to is, if we have large particles in that material, it's not going to get enough contact. So I'll show you some stuff right here. This is peat moss and a cocoa coir mix, right? So if you look at this, it's really, really fine. So this will make sure that the seed has a lot of contact. Some of the seed mixes out there, or if you get the bagged soil mix, you'll get something that looks like this. This right here, it's too chunky. It's too big. The seed's not going to make enough contact with the soil, and then it's going to have a very difficult time germinating and then getting its roots set in, because those roots are going to be really small. So it needs a lot of contact with that soil to be able to start growing. So the next thing we'll kind of talk about is uh, now that we have the seed contact, we know what particle size we need for that. We'll talk about the size of the seed. I know sometimes it's difficult. How deep do I do it? How deep do I stick it? Do I just sprinkle it on top? And it really depends. In this case, we've got like cherry seeds here. I got some pumpkin seeds, and then we've got some uh, kale seeds, right? So the kale seeds are like these tiny little pearls, right? Super small. So how do you know how deep you're gonna put it into the soil? It's a real simple answer to that, right? So in this case, we got a seed here, and I got a bigger seed here. So the size of the seed is how deep you're actually going to put it into the soil. So if this is the seed, this is the top of the soil, I want the seed to be that far down into the soil. So the width of the seed, that's how far down you're going to put it into the soil. And that's pretty much it. For your smaller seeds, sometimes like basil and strawberries and stuff like that, if they're super fine and super small, just sprinkling them on top and making sure that they make good contact. So kind of patting it down. Maybe sprinkle a little bit of the fine soil mix that you have on top, but just barely. You don't want to cover up that seed too much. So the bigger seeds, it's easier. The smaller ones, you want to just put them on top and sprinkle with a little bit of soil on top. The key is good soil contact and keeping that seed moist. Talking about seeds, the seeds should probably be fresh. I've got this container right here where I've kept the seeds for who knows how long. It's probably not the best way to go about it. I'm probably going to have some die off because the seeds are so old. So use fresh seeds. If you can get them that year, that's probably the best way to go about it. The older the seeds are, the less viable they are, and they might not sprout on you. If that's okay with you, like me, and you just keep them, just plant more. Plant all of them. That way you have a better chance of getting some of those to actually sprout. Now, I know sometimes people add nutrients and all this fertilizer and things into the seed mix, and that's all fine and dandy when the seed sprouts. But just to get the seed sprouted, the seed has everything it needs inside of that little shell. It's kind of like babies, right? They have everything they need, and they get it from their mother. But once that baby is separated from its mom, now it's relying on nutrients from an outside source. Seeds are the same way. Once they break that shell and they come out, they're okay. But then when they start creating roots, they need nutrients from outside somewhere else. So in your seed starting mix, you don't necessarily need any type of nutrients. You just need a good baseline, and then everything will be good to go for a little while until the plant starts growing, and then it'll need additional nutrients. If you did want to add additional nutrients in there, then you can do that. There's a bunch of different stuff out there. I'm always in the frame of mind of using Mother Nature, right? So anything that's natural, that's what I'm going to use. I like using sifted compost. And of course, adding the worm castings in for me is a must. If you did want to add other things like rock dust or kelp, fish meal, bone meal, blood meal, feather meal, oatmeal, any types of those things, you can. You just don't need to add a lot of it, right? So smaller quantities is more than enough. You don't need a bunch of that stuff in there. So if I had to give you a number, usually if I try to do nutrients, about half a cup of total nutrients for about 7.5 gallons. So 1 cubic foot of material. It's not a lot, right? So it's used very sparingly. So if you want to add that to your seed mix, you could. It'll get a little jump start. That way, if you do have these little pots and containers like this, where you're going to keep them in there for a little while, or if you're going to let them grow out in these solo cups, they'll have a little bit to go off of, and they don't have you'll give them a better fighting chance to get going. And then the last thing is your base mix, right? We kind of talked about the particulate size, like, okay, that's great, fine and dandy, but like, what is it? What am I supposed to put in there? And there's a lot of people out there have their own mix, and I like to go with basically what they have set up as well. So I like to use a third peat moss, a third vermiculite, and a split the third worm castings and sifted compost. And for me, that's a good start. I'm okay with that, and I have no problems getting seeds started. You can also mix these ingredients up, right? So you can trade out the peat moss for cocoa coir. You can trade out the vermiculite for perlite or rice hulls or anything else that's going to provide a little bit of air into your soil, right? And moisture holding capabilities. And then you need that life, and you're going to get the microorganisms from the worm castings and the compost. Not all compost and not all worm castings are created equal. I make sure the biology is in there. We test those weekly as we harvest to make sure that it meets minimum requirements. If it's in a sealed bag that you buy from the store and that's all you can get it. If you can get a good source that is alive and local, then I would recommend doing that. This is kind of how I get seeds started from the beginning until I get them sprouted. So getting them on a calendar, figuring out when I'm actually going to plant these, and working backwards from the date that's actually on the seed bag. In this case, if I don't have a seed bag, then I have to Google it and figure out how long it's going to take to get production out of it. So deciding what type of containers I want to go with, whether I'm going to do domed containers, individual cells, solo cups, or am I going to do soil blocks? All this is important. And then trying to figure out how I'm going to cover these things to make sure I keep the moisture inside, right? Keeping it covered until it sprouts is key. Once it sprouts, then you want to take that cover off and let it grow. After that, we talked about the soil mix, right? Making sure that we get that soil to seed contact, right? We want to make sure that the soil, that the amendments, the mix that we're using is really fine. The more contact, the more things touch that seed, the better chance of it's going to be germinate. And then don't push it down so far. The bigger it is, the farther it goes down. The smaller it is, the smaller it stays, or the farther it stays on top. So, and then the baseline, a third of some type of peat moss cocoa coir, a third of vermiculite, perlite, rice hulls, something like that, and then a third, a mixture of half and half sifted compost and worm castings. The finer it is, the better. Mix all that stuff together. That's a good baseline to get your seed starting mix started. If you want to add nutrients, you can. Half a cup to 1 cubic foot or 7.5 gallons, and that should get you going. Thanks for sticking around for this. Hopefully you got some good information out of this, and we'll see you on the next one.